Hello, and a very warm welcome to this evening's event from the University of Southampton, to all of you joining us from around the world. My name is John Copley. I'm an alumnus and associate professor in ocean exploration and public engagement within ocean and earth science here at the University of Southampton. My research explores patterns of life in deep sea environments which cover most of our planet and face increasing impacts from climate change, pollution and extraction of resources. And I also have enjoyed working with documentary makers to share the exploration of the deep ocean with people worldwide through series such as BBC Blue Planet 2. Now, in recent years, we've all witnessed devastating floods, wildfires and damage of pollution. So as countries are preparing to meet this weekend for the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, this evening we want to take you through the impacts that climate change is having on our ocean and what we're doing here at the University of Southampton to adapt our relationship with the ocean in a responsible way. Research in the UK has put us at the forefront of tackling and adapting to climate change, and tonight I'm delighted that we're joined with three world-leading experts from the university. So over the next hour, we'll hear how and why we need to work together globally to take action to protect our ocean and its critical ecosystems, build a more sustainable, resilient, and both greener and bluer future for us all. Now, before we get started, you'll see a Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. So please add your questions throughout the next hour, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's first speaker, Professor Harry Bryden. Harry is an oceanographer here at the University of Southampton, and his pioneering work has shed light on many areas of oceanography. And over the course of his career, he's monitored the temperature and circulation of the planet's most important ocean currents. He's received many awards across his career, authored more than 100 scientific papers, and he's also the only Regius Professor of Ocean Sciences appointed by the Queen in the UK. So tonight, Harry will be starting things off by telling us just how dynamic the ocean is, how much change we're seeing in the ocean, and the impacts that those changes are having.
Thank you, John. I'm Harry Bryden, and I'm a professor in the School of Ocean and Earth Sciences at the University of Southampton. And John has asked me to give an introduction to the topic today. And the title of my introduction is The Dynamic Ocean. The ocean is dynamic, ever-changing on weekly, seasonal, and interannual timescales, and on regional to basin scale to global scales. The ocean circulation has effects on our weather, our climate, and on the structure and productivity of marine ecosystems. The first figure is a schematic of the surface ocean circulation in the North Atlantic, which is shown with the arrows, and it's superimposed on the February sea surface temperature distribution. Note the complexity of the circulation and how it affects the surface temperature. In particular, this is a February sea surface temperature, so it's late winter, and note how the water is so warm as it goes up past Scandinavia. It's greater than 5 degrees centigrade all the way up past the northern parts of Norway. There's a tendency for people and some scientists to think of the ocean as a vast, uniform, unchanging reservoir, but the ocean is in fact a vibrant, dynamical system. On global scales, we are changing ocean conditions. Global warming is really ocean warming. The ocean warms due to changes in solar radiation associated with increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the ocean then warms the atmosphere. This figure shows the global trend in sea surface temperature. In many regions, the ocean is warming by as much as 1 degree centigrade per decade. But note there are regions of cooling too in the Antarctic, and notably in the region south of Iceland, which is cooling by up to 1 degree centigrade per decade. It is estimated that 90% of the global warming is in the ocean. The warmer ocean expands and causes sea level to rise. The next figure shows sea level rising, and these are sea level trends in millimeters per year. Sea level has been measured globally by satellite since 1992, so we've gotten a good picture of the sea level rise over the ocean, everywhere in the ocean, greatly improving our earlier estimates of sea level rise from coastal tide gauges. This figure shows how sea level is rising almost everywhere at a global rate of 4 centimeters per decade. The patterns of sea level rise also reflect changes in ocean circulation. For example, the reduced sea surface slope across the Gulf Stream, north of 35 degrees north latitude, suggests a declining strength of the Gulf Stream. Most of the concern about sea level rise has surrounded issues of coastal flooding. At University of Southampton, Professor Ivan Haig is an expert on the effects of sea level rise on local coastal defenses. The ocean is also taking up carbon dioxide that has been injected into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. This figure shows the uptake of anthropogenic carbon dioxide everywhere. It's everywhere in the surface ocean, but on a column-weighted basis, the largest amounts of carbon dioxide are in the North Atlantic, where deep water formation carries the added surface carbon dioxide down into the deep ocean. So the deep ocean ecosystems can be affected by increasing carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide in the ocean increases the acidity of the ocean, and the combination of ocean warming and acidification can have dramatic consequences for marine ecosystems such as coral reefs. At the University of Southampton, Professor Jörg Wiedemann is an expert on the combined effects of warming and acidification on coral reefs. Now, my research is focused on understanding how the ocean circulation will change due to the increases in temperature, sea level, and carbon dioxide, and how these changes will feed back on the Earth's climate. We have regular satellite monitoring of ocean sea surface conditions, but we've also now we've built global networks to monitor the subsurface ocean throughout the global ocean. Here is a network, the global network of profiling Argo floats. 3,000 floats profile the temperature, salinity, and oxygen every 10 days from surface to 2,000 meters depth throughout the global ocean. So this figure shows a typical day with the distribution of the profiles that we get from the surface down to 2,000 meters. In Southampton, we have developed the rapid monitoring system to measure the North Atlantic Ocean circulation. This figure shows the rapid array of moored instruments along 26 North superimposed on a schematic of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. Coupled climate models suggest that this circulation will decline over the next 50 years, with profound effects on Atlantic and European climate. The rapid array has been operational continuously now since 2004. Using Argo, satellite observations of the sea surface, and rapid observations, we are trying to understand the causes of the changes in ocean circulation and their effects, such as the cooling of the ocean south of Iceland, and what effects these changes will have on our seasonal and interannual climate variations. So I look forward to discussing the ocean circulation and how it's changing and what effects it will have on us in the discussion tonight. And so now it's back to you, John.
Thank you, Harry, for setting the scene with that introduction to our changing ocean. And what always strikes me is how those changes are tangible rather than hypothetical. They're based on measurements that we've been just seen there, that we've been making in the oceans. And of course, engineering has been key in enabling those measurements through the Argo floats and the rapid array that you've been telling us about. So I'm now very pleased to introduce our next guest, Professor Susan Gourvennec. Susan is an alumna and is Professor of Offshore Geotechnical Engineering at the University of Southampton. As a specialist in offshore geotechnical engineering, Susan's role at the university includes leading programs of research that advance engineering design in the ocean, and of course sharing her expertise through teaching our students. Over the course of her career, Susan has worked on projects ranging from investigating the performance of Victorian tunnels in London to developing enabling technologies for construction in the deep ocean. So Susan brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this evening's event, and it's my pleasure to welcome her to talk about how we intervene in the oceans and what future challenges and solutions look like.
Well, thank you, John, and I'm delighted to be part of this event. So my name is Susan Gourvennec and I'm a Professor of Offshore Geotechnical Engineering here at the University of Southampton, and I hold a Royal Academy of Engineering Chair in Emerging Technologies for Intelligent and Resilient Ocean Engineering. I'm also one of the Deputy Directors of the Southampton Marine and Maritime Institute and an Ocean Sector Lead for the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub, which is hosted and run out of Southampton. And I'm going to talk about ocean interventions. And in the presentation, I'm going to touch on why we go to the oceans, what needs we meet by going to the oceans, how we intervene in the oceans to meet those needs, some of the challenges faced by us and by the oceans with those interventions, and some potential solutions. So the ocean is big. It covers 70% of our planet's surface. It connects us and our land masses, and increasingly it's seen as providing space, as land space becomes more stressed by increasing demand for living space and resources for a growing population. Forecasts indicate that there will be 9 billion of us by 2050, 11 billion by 2100. And by European or US standards, we will need 4 or 5 planets to sustain our growing demand for resources. And many have turned attention to the oceans to meet those needs. Now, the oceans do hold indispensable resources, but we must use them responsibly. And when going to the oceans to meet our needs, consider the needs of the oceans, that, as we know, sustain us well beyond the range of resources that we intervene in the oceans for. So first, let's look at what needs we meet through ocean interventions. The offshore oil and gas industry is well known, and from its infancy in the 1950s to the present day, around 5,000 oil and gas structures have been installed in our oceans and provide around 30% of global crude oil, largely used for transportation fuel, alongside providing significant quantities of natural gas. And that natural gas is used for cooking and heating, is burned in power stations to generate electricity, and can be cooled to become liquid and used as a transportation fuel. Petrochemicals derived from hydrocarbons are present in almost everything we rely on daily, and demand for plastic is a key driver for petrochemical demand. And since the 1990s, but at much greater pace in the last decade, we go to the oceans for renewable electricity generation. A global shipping fleet of more than 50,000 commercial vessels moves people and goods around the world, and 90% of world trade is carried across the ocean by ship. So most of the stuff we buy has travelled to us by ship. We go to the oceans for fish and seafood, either wild catch or from aquaculture. And more than 170 million tonnes of fish is caught annually worldwide. And maybe least visible or known to us of our ocean interventions is that 99% of internet communication travels through more than 1.3 million kilometres of submarine cables globally. And by relying on that internet connection, you can find out more about our ocean interventions and how they contribute to our everyday lives by downloading this brochure from our IRO website. So we have looked at some of the things that we get from the oceans. And so now let's have a look at how we intervene in the oceans to meet those needs and how this is changing. Our interventions can be through fixed or floating infrastructure such as oil and gas platforms and more recently offshore wind turbines, for which there is a host of different architectures to support the structures that we see above the waterline. And the most significant change in these interventions is the scale. the volume of installations required during the transition to renewable energy, given that many more wind turbines are needed than oil and gas platforms for equivalent energy yield. And it is not just offshore wind infrastructure, but a range of other ocean-based energy harvesting devices with a range of architectures and infrastructure. And here we can see some of the other infrastructure placed in our oceans to provide communications, food, and novel urban or industrial uses of ocean space. And in addition to fixed infrastructure, a vast global fleet of commercial vessels travels across the oceans, from bulk carriers to cruise liners, and requires vast port infrastructure to support those transport links. So the challenge we face with ocean interventions is essentially balancing our increased demand for resources and demands on the oceans with the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions and other pollution and reduce damage and indeed restore ecosystems. The scale of forecast industrialisation of the oceans is unprecedented, and monitoring at meaningful spatial and temporal scale to understand the impacts of the scale of these interventions is essential to enable us to make responsible and informed choices. There is also the challenge of what to do with these structures and the ships that have been used to meet our needs during their design life when they are no longer serviceable. So just a reminder about the offshore decommissioning context. I mean, there are a lot of structures. They are very large and they often contain hazardous materials, particularly oil and gas rigs and ships. And in the transition to renewable energy, particularly offshore wind, much composites in the blades that cannot be recycled. And while safe and responsible decommissioning activities take place, and in particular for fixed ocean structures, too often this is not the case, in particular for ships and floating offshore structures. And in 2020, 70% of the world's end-of-life ships and offshore floating units were decommissioned on beaches in South Asia in conditions like this, and often the infrastructure being delivered for deconstruction still laden with toxic waste, causing harm to workers, communities, and of course the ocean. So we have looked at some of the reasons we intervene in the oceans to meet our needs and some of the challenges we face. But what about the solutions? There are certainly many important and urgent engineering and technical innovations to develop infrastructure to support a decarbonised energy sector, to improve efficiency of energy generation and use, to develop new methods to monitor and understand the impacts of our interventions at meaningful spatial and temporal scales, and to develop technical solutions to support responsible decommissioning and disposal of ocean infrastructure. But we also need an equal paradigm shift in mindset, from a conquering mentality to a collaborative one, collaborating with the ocean environment, considering the needs of the oceans in our design of ocean infrastructure when we go to the oceans to meet our needs. A landmark government report review recently showed that our current way of exploiting nature is outstripping its ability to recover. So we cannot just do ocean interventions bigger and more efficiently than before to meet our increased needs. We must reimagine our ocean interventions. And some ideas for reimagining our ocean interventions are explored in this recent article on the Conversation platform as part of their Oceans 21 series for the run-up to COP26. And I also created a LinkedIn community associated with my chair in emerging technologies to join like-minded people together to explore how we could reimagine how we intervene in our oceans. And looking forward, essentially we must find new ways to intervene in our oceans. A combination of technical innovations, economic and policy levers, and socially acceptable ways to balance our needs and demands on the ocean with the ocean's needs and limits. And so to finish by paraphrasing Mahatma Gandhi, that the world may have enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed.
Thank you, Susan. I'm continually amazed at all the different ways that ocean interventions intersect with our everyday lives. And I think it's well worth reflecting that right now, this event is being broadcast to you all around the world via that very network of seafloor cables that Susan has just been telling us about. Now, Susan has mentioned there at the end the need for economic and policy interventions as well as engineering innovations. And this weekend, we'll see global leaders meet for COP26. And for many people, this is the world's last chance to get climate change under control. Now, the UK has taken steps to try to be a leader on climate and try to balance climate action with economic growth. So we'll now hear from Dr. Waseem Dabbouq, who will tell us more from that governmental perspective, including how the UK is planning to reach net zero and how the ocean is involved in meeting that goal. Waseem is an alumnus and Marine and Maritime Policy Research Fellow at Southampton, and he specialises in designing and delivering policy engagement activities which help to inform those all-important government decisions. Waseem, it's great to have you with us tonight. I look forward to what you have to tell us.
Thank you very much, John, for the introductions, and thank you, Harry and Susan, for your wonderful presentations. My name is Waseem Dabbouq, and I will be talking to you about Her Majesty's government's perspective about how we can still save our oceans. At the end of my presentation, I hope that you will come out knowing more about how the protection of the marine environment is perceived by the government within its wider climate change objectives, and also about how what the government's approach is to the protection and use of UK waters. I'll be focusing these two sections on the growing role that the marine environment could play in climate mitigation specifically, as opposed to as distinct from adapting to climate change risks and protection of the marine biodiversity more broadly. And finally, I hope that we will come out knowing more about what we can do to save our oceans. Allow me first to begin by laying out the broad policy objective in the UK around climate change, and these could be grouped under these headings. So first of all, the imperative to reduce CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions domestically. Second of all, the imperative to adapt to climate change risks, and finally, to work with international partners to secure global emission reductions. In the UK, the Climate Change Act 2008 provides the framework for climate change policy, and it creates the Climate Change Committee, whose function is to advise government on carbon budgets, but also on identifying risks and on assessing progress towards tackling those risks. At the same time, so in response to that climate change risk assessment, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has the responsibility to produce a national adaptation program which sets out how the government aims to address those risks that have been identified. I would like to jump straight ahead to the assessment of the Climate Change Act and its success, and I would like to look at two official documents, namely the Grantham Institute report, first of all, in 2018, which, although it set out achievements, including the improvement of the debate around climate change issues in the UK, highlighted that the Climate Change Act provides certainty about targets but not policies, and that as a result, there are problems not around the Act itself, but in the way that policymakers have acted under the framework that it has created. And somewhat in confirmation of that, the Public Accounts Committee has published its report following its inquiry on achieving net zero, and highlighted that the government must ensure that key sector strategies and as well as an overarching net zero strategy must be published by September 2021. These reports highlight the role that the UK still can do around climate change policies and how much behind we are. And this is despite the fact that in 2019, as we all know, the UK committed to a net zero objective by 2050, and that according to its definition of net zero, it relies on it reserves a role for carbon sequestration alongside reducing emissions. And importantly, carbon sequestration relies on big part on the natural environment, but more specifically the marine environment, and that's what our interest is in this presentation. And this is what I would like to assess by looking at whether or not there's a growing role in the UK strategy for the blue economy in this framework. And this leads me to a brief definition of the blue economy as provided by the World Bank Group. So the blue economy is sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and jobs, and ocean ecosystem health. And of course, it touches upon many activities, but the one I want to really focus on in this presentation is climate change and the potential role that the oceans can play as a carbon sink and helping mitigating climate change. So has that been reflected in the development of the UK's vision around its seas? And the first, I would like to go back to the initial strategy in 2002, which was based around creating a marine environment of healthy, clean, safe, productive, and biologically diverse seas. This initial strategy was supplemented by our Seas Shared Resources, Shared Resource 2009, which set high-level marine objectives to take forward this vision. And lastly, by the Marine Strategy Part 1, the first version of 2012, which set a comprehensive framework for assessing, monitoring, and taking action across the UK seas to deliver the vision. Importantly, this vision was very much based upon an ecosystem-based approach, recognizing the interactions between different components of the ecosystem and the imperative to protect the marine environment as a whole. But specifically around climate change, it was perceived as a long-term threat, which requires the development of adaptation strategies as opposed to mitigation, to focusing on the role of its mitigation role, based on scenarios because of to try to cope with the lack of evidence. But with a changing policy landscape, most notably because of Brexit that entered into force in January 2020, the development of the international policy landscape around climate change and the race to net zero, and the imperative to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and a clean and healthy way for the natural environment as well as for humans. So as a result of these events and these developments, we started noticing a shift towards integrating a natural approach to UK marine environmental policy and a growing recognition of the value of the marine environment in achieving both economic recovery but also net zero emissions. And as a result of that, we started seeing a flurry of new policy documents across the departments, but most importantly and very recently, the net zero strategy that was published last week. And I want to highlight something about this strategy, and it talks about, for the first time, it explicitly talks about reducing emissions while balancing other climate and environmental objectives. Importantly, the strategy recognized a role for the blue economy habitats for both climate adaptation and carbon sequestration, but at the same time, it highlighted insufficiency of data and lacks of knowledge to understand their specific role, and committed itself to reducing that evidence gap. Another document that I want to highlight here is the UK Marine Strategy in 2019, which also recognized the role for nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation. So definitely we're seeing a shift in the narrative that's being used, but what's important is what government does on the ground, of course. So, and that I want to tackle some of the actions that the government sees as achievements before going into how much more work still needs to be done. So out of these, I want to focus on the Sustainable Fisheries Policy, which following Brexit in particular, and the Fisheries Act that came into effect as well, and the rising number of marine protected areas, 370 plus MPAs at the moment, the announcement of marine plans recently by the MMO, and finally, a number of research projects around marine biodiversity as part of the Green Recovery Challenge projects. Internationally, the UK plays an important role through a number of initiatives and alliances. Broadly, the UK aims to support other countries, most notably in the Commonwealth, and more specifically, small island developing states, and acknowledging the value of their natural environment for the blue economy, and fighting and ensuring climate mitigation as well as adaptation to the risks of climate change. And as well, of course, the UK also wants to play an important role in decarbonizing shipping through the International Maritime Organization, and protecting marine biodiversity through COP15, and ensuring that climate resilience and net zero go hand in hand through its leadership of COP26. However, there's a lot more that still needs to be done, and this has been reflected in multiple ways, most notably the Environmental Audit Sustainable Seas Inquiry in 2019, which the University of Southampton responded to, including John. The report of this inquiry raised major concerns about threats to the existing threats to the marine and biodiversity. It also revealed shortcomings in the enforcement of the Marine Protected Areas Network, On the other hand, the most recent climate change risk assessment specifically and expressly identified risks for marine biodiversity and natural carbon stores from warming and acidification as a direct risk from climate change to net zero. And of course, we have just looked at the new net zero strategy and the gaps that it highlighted. So it's not really clear how the race to net zero runs hand in hand with the race to resilience at the moment. So what can the government do, and how can the research community contribute? There are many ways that the research community could help inform the strategy, including through responding to calls for evidence. There are a number of calls for evidence that are currently open, including one around the Marine Strategy Part 3, and also the role that nature-based solutions could play in achieving net zero. Through funding competitions like the Clean Maritime Demonstration, which the University of Southampton won 4 projects under. But of course, the role is not only for the academics to play, and everybody can play a role. And first of all, these are some of the examples. And first of all, the marine planning process. And if that's of interest for you, please get in touch with me after the session. I can tell you more details about that. But second of all, the role that behavior change plays. And after recognition that as much as 62% of future reductions in emissions will rely on individual choices and behaviors. And finally, the role that the public would play in scrutinizing reports by government in terms of its achievements working towards net zero. So, in short, it is not late to save our oceans, and everybody has a role to play. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I hope you.
Thank you, Waseem. That was a great overview of how the ocean is involved in the development of all these different policy areas. And I think highlighting some of the challenges that we face for securing the future of the oceans, but also hopefully ways in which the ocean may be part of the solution to the challenges of which it's a part. Now, if you haven't done so already, now is definitely the time to get your questions in for our panel, please. You can find that question box on the right-hand side of your screen. So I'd like to welcome back Harry, Susan and Waseem and kick off the question and answer session with a question that was submitted in advance. Heidi Mail asks us, how can we as the general public have a positive influence on this matter? So Harry, do you have any initial thoughts on that one?
Well, I think all our eyes are presently on the COP26 that's going to start this weekend, but we oceanographers are also in the beginning stage of the International Decade of the Ocean, the UN Decade of the Ocean. And every country is making plans about what the national program should be for this Decade of the Ocean. I think the national in Southampton is looking for input on what should be done. And in particular, there's going to be a meeting of the Society for Marine Science in the 18th of November. It's going to be a Zoom meeting, I believe, or a Teams meeting. And they're actively looking for ideas about what we should be doing as in the UK for the Decade of the Ocean.
Great, thanks very much, Harry. So there are opportunities to sort of make sure that what we care about is represented as these programs develop that are international, targeting the problem. Susan, do you have any thoughts and perspectives on this one as to what we can do as members of the general public?
Thanks, John. Well, I think indeed get involved in some of these big initiatives, but I think there is just also so much that we can do as individuals in our everyday lives to improve the health of the oceans, because so much of what we do, even though on land, affects the health of our oceans. So I think just to start, we can all be more thoughtful about our personal choices, about what we consume and how we consume it. We can question ourselves, do I need to update my smartphone or my car or my wardrobe? All of these things use resources that burn at the moment mostly fossil fuels that lead to climate change and global warming that affect the health of our oceans. Do I need to eat meat every day, for example? Could I move towards a plant-based diet? Again, these will help mitigate the effects of climate change, which will help the health of the oceans. Challenge ourselves about how we travel, move to a green energy provider, and of course use your consumer voice to put some pressure on larger organisations. If if they don't, or to encourage them to have really authentic and substantial green plans.
Great, thanks very much, Susan. Yes, indeed, lots for us to reflect on in all those different types of personal choice that we're involved in. Wasim, you alluded to some of the things that we can do as individuals at the end of your talk there. So would you like to expand a little bit further on that?
Yes, sure. Thank you, John. And first of all, I would like to reiterate what Susan just said. I think that's, there's an understanding that as much as I said, 62% of future reductions will depend on these choices that we make and the changes in our patterns and our behavior. And also the government's latest net zero strategy is actually based on that. It's based it's focused on consumers and giving people, the population, a lot of alternatives and options, better options for the environment. So there's a strong emphasis, and I think this is the biggest role that we can play, and this is why I want to start by that. But I think especially if you're in the UK, there are other ways for you to engage if you're a member of the public, and that's including through the marine planning process, which is organized by the MMO, but involves public participation at different levels. First of all, through setting the plan in the first place and drafting the plan, but also a public consultation after the draft plan is in place. This is the place where I think plans are local, spread out across the UK waters, but this is the place where individuals who are placed in those locations could engage and have a loud voice and highlighting the value of the marine environment and some of the issues that we were discussing now. And I think lastly, I would like to also mention calls for evidence that are currently being launched by government and parliament. And I just want to stress that these are not only for academics or industry actors, but also for the public. So some of these consultations are actually targeted towards the public to express their views around certain decisions that will be made. So yes, broadly, these are three ways that we as a public could engage. But I want to go back to the choices that we make and the patterns that we adopt.
Thank you, Wasim, and thank you all for your perspectives there, and thank you, Heidi, for the question. For our next question, I'd like to turn to one asked by Shenhui Gao, who asks, what exactly do we save in the oceans? What is it that we're trying to preserve? What are the critical things that we need to be protecting? So again, Harry, would you like to start us off with that one, perhaps?
Well, I think the ocean is going to change. It's going to get warmer and more acidic. And I think we have to accept that those are going to be the big effects on the marine ecosystems and productivity. So what comes to mind first is coral reefs. And, can we protect the coral reefs in some way? And also in terms of the deep sea ecosystems or deep sea coral reefs, which are also going to have acidification, can we protect them? And I think those are the two things that spring to my mind first for what we're trying to save.
Great, thanks very much, Harry. Susan, what do you think?
Well, thanks, John. So I think there are obviously things in the ocean that we need to save as well, that Harry has touched on, but so much of just trying to minimize our negative effects on the ocean is going to have so much effect to us on land as well, in terms of the sea level rise and so on that Harry talked about in his talk, to the changes, the large, wider changes on climate, and all of those climate patterns being driven by the oceans, and having a devastating effect already on many populations around the world. So I think much to save in the ocean, but also we should not take our eye off the effect of things that will be saved on land if we can take better care of the oceans.
Great, thanks very much, Susan. Now, Wasim, perhaps from your perspective, what are we already targeting, and what are we not yet targeting in terms of ocean protection?
So if I go from the start, I was just saying that the UK strategy was 2002 focused on protecting having an ecosystem approach, so understanding the relationships between different components of the main ecosystem. So that was really the focus early on. But of course, it hasn't, even though it did a lot of initiatives, the status of the seas, our seas, were still in a critical situation, and there were a lot of causes for concern. But I think the switch, the focus on the role that the oceans could play in mitigating climate change is what we need to protect, and protecting marine habitats and for their capacity to absorb carbon and contribute in achieving net zero. And this is an area that government is very slow at picking up, despite the changes in the policy landscape. And it has been highlighted in many strategies around that sets out the evidence gaps that need to be targeted, and a lot of calls for evidence around it, but still progress is being very, very slow from the government side, and the recognition of this role for the marine environment. So I would say, generally, I think we need to protect certain species, of course, because of the understanding of the interrelation of the main ecosystem, but at the same time protecting these habitats specifically for their role in mitigating climate change.
Great, thanks very much, Waseem. Now, Sam Robinson has asked, do we need more ocean knowledge or better ocean protection? And how do we police all the threats to the ocean environment, and who should do it? So if you'd like to maybe take whichever part of that question you'd like to speak about, Waseem, straight over to you, I think, on that one. How do we police the threats in particular? Who should do it, perhaps?
Absolutely. Yes, I actually wanted you to repeat the question a little bit. I couldn't hear all of the question.
Oh, okay. So do we need more ocean knowledge or better ocean protection? How do we police the threats to the ocean environment, and who should do it?
I think we need all of that. There are certainly important knowledge gaps that are existing there now, especially again on the role that nature-based solutions could play in mitigating climate change. So there's a big role for the research community to play now, specifically now, and then the marine there are certain regulators of the UK and internationally that would have a role to play in implementing this knowledge and taking it forward. Of course, it has to be included in strategies and plans from governments, but we need them to be enforced on the ground in the end. So there's concerns around, for example, there's a lot of talk about 38% of UK waters being covered by the Marine Protected Areas Network, and the growing number of those areas, but at the same time concerns about how well those are being implemented, and how much protection we're actually affording to the main ecosystem. So there's work to be done in both of those fronts, I would say.
Great, thanks very much, Waseem. Susan, what are your thoughts?
I think we certainly need ocean knowledge. We continuously need to have ocean knowledge because, as Harry says, the oceans are changing. So we need to keep pace with that and make sure that we are informed about how the oceans are changing, particularly due to our activities and our interventions, so that we can be more and more confident that we are making better choices as we go to the oceans. I think there are also many technology solutions for helping to collect that data, or to in fact police marine protected areas as well. But this is such a complex and socio-economic tension about why marine protected areas are violated and so on. And so there are many solutions well beyond the technical that need to be dealt with there. So, you know, why individuals or organizations are not following the rules for such things, I think. And again, I think it's, you know, it's not just the activities in the ocean, it's our activities on land that we also need to measure and monitor and adapt and change in order to protect the oceans. It's not just activities in the ocean that will help save the oceans. Great,
thanks very much, Susan. Harry, I kind of know what your answer might be if I give you just a straight choice between more ocean knowledge or better ocean protection, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about, what are the benefits of continuing to get more knowledge about the ocean?
Actually, I was going to go for the other part. I think the marine protected areas, I think, are defined in terms of space, but not really defined in terms of what it is they're being protected from. And I think possibly we need to develop a policy about what is to be protected in marine protected areas, and then it will be different for each one. I think that's what hinders us. We have so many different marine protected areas, and I'm really in favor of picking one or a few protected areas. And what I would say is that if we define what is to be protected, I think we have the capabilities in terms of the measurement system, monitoring system, that we can actually monitor them. And then the question about policing is also comes down to, can you find out who's doing the bad stuff to the marine protected area? But I think we have the technical capability to monitor vast regions of the ocean with new technology.
Great. Thanks very much to all of you. I think that's really encouraging to hear how both technical innovation and a knowledge base of ocean science and indeed a legislative framework might come together to really address that challenge. Now, we've had a few questions that are really specific to the individual areas that you've covered in your talk. So I'd like to take a few of those next. First of all, one for you, Susan. Helen Payne asks, what is seasteading? You mentioned it as one of the interventions in your talk.
Okay, so this is a notion of using the ocean space for urban or perhaps some industrial activities. So you might build a community on a floating island in the ocean, and that would be seasteading. There are other adaptations of that where you might have a floating port that is not connected to the land, or other kinds of floating industrial applications to sort of move these activities away from the coastal region so that coastal communities can prosper from making good use of that coastal space and put the industrial activities further from shore. But seasteading, started with the idea that we might all go and live in communities on the ocean.
Great.
Which, as an offshore engineering, is an interesting idea, because working offshore is an incredibly difficult and dangerous and process that is wrapped in so much health and safety, that the idea that we would all go live offshore on floating platforms is interesting.
So not such an easy floating future for us as we perhaps might imagine if we not familiar with it. Thanks very much for that. Wasim, one for you. Juliet Bailey asks, says personal choice is not enough. Manufacturers need to extend the life of computers and so on. Where does the government sit in helping consumers to use less resources in that way?
Well, I think when it comes to, the government has published a series of documents covering a wide range of areas that affect our lives in general, including the transport strategy, for example, a hydrogen strategy, etc. So the government is making a lot of efforts to make us consume, to emit less carbon, living in our homes, going to work, flying to another place, but it's also imposing more and more obligations on manufacturers and suppliers of fuels, etc. So we're on the way. Let's say that's the effort is being done, but the road is still very long, and the effort from government side is, like I said earlier, to provide consumers with better options going forward, better options that would be less environmentally harmful. I think, did I answer that question?
Yeah. Great, thank you very much, Wasim. Harry, a question for you. We often hear, and this is from Andrew Clive Taylor, do you think the Gulf Stream will switch off? It's something we often hear a little bit in the media. Can you take us through what the reality is of the situation?
I think we are in Southampton, as I mentioned, we are monitoring the system of currents in the North, particularly with this question as to whether the circulation will slow down. I think the coupled climate models on which much of our policy is based are quite uniform in saying that the North Atlantic Ocean circulation will slow down with quite dramatic effects on climate. And I believe that some of that decline will come from less Gulf Stream flow. It's not, the whole Gulf Stream is not going to shut down. We're still going to have a wind-driven Gulf Stream, but the part that is what we might call buoyancy-driven may indeed slow down over the next 50 years. That's what the models indicate.
Great, thanks for that, Harry. Okay, a question for all of you, and I'd like to come to Susan first with this one. Alistair Forder asks, what do you believe is the role of industry in tackling our oceans challenge?
Oh, well, I mean, manyfold, and obviously depending on the industry. But I think being able to put the priorities of any industry beyond sort of the self-interest of that company and thinking about what that organization can do for sustainability or for the planet rather than just for that company. And that's just really an extension of what we can all do as human beings, is moving from self-interest to a more global interest. But I mean, the role of industry, whether it's entrepreneurial activities and SMEs, like really driving some of the innovative new technologies or methodologies, or whether it's like very big business who really have the resources to actually implement and action some of these interventions at the scale that they are going to happen, that everybody is sort of united by the philosophy of why we're going to the oceans and has a suitably wide range of metrics about how to measure what we call success, and that can't be single bottom line accounting. I think is often driving industry.
Great, thank you, Susan. Wasim, what are your thoughts on the role of industry?
Well, I think first of all, I think it's very easy for us as members of the public to jump straight at industry actors. I think it's tempting even for us to do that initially, and I feel for them a little bit in this context, because I feel like they're being stuck. Industry actors in general, like Susan said, it depends on the industry, of course. They're being driven by regulations, and regulation is not developing quickly enough because of a lot of political points, but also the gaps of evidence and gaps in knowledge. So they're waiting to be driven. I mean, industry actors are waiting to be driven by the regulations set by policymakers. And I think what could be reasonably expected of everyone, every industry actor, is to collaborate with policymakers, collaborate with academics, the academic community, to work together to find these solutions that, in the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to take them forward. And in the end, they're the ones who are going to offer us as members of the public with these choices that could change the way we're doing things.
Great, thanks, Wasim. Harry, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a very broad question, and I think industry should be thinking about what we might call green solutions, and not putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, limiting their energy usage as much as possible, and to the extent that they can use green energy. I feel there ought to be, I suppose, an attitude change, not just an economic change, but an attitude that we are not going to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Great, thanks, Harry. And so what works, I think, nicely is a follow-up question, this time from Beth Parsons, and I'll come straight back to you, Harry, with this to start with. If you could change one government policy tomorrow to help save the oceans, what would it be? So what do you think on that one, Harry? Just one thing you could change, magic wand.
I don't really have one. A tax on carbon emissions.
Okay, thanks very much. Susan, how about you?
So I think similarly, it's about trying to make those other options appealing and acceptable to industry and the public. So some greater metrics about how we measure things. It can't all be about, well, it is about financial costs, but how we value different parts to put into that equation, whether that's societal impacts or environmental impacts or so on. It can't be just the direct cost of the labour and the resources that goes into making these things. And if the government could embrace a wider range of economic metrics, different economic frameworks, I think that would really enable industry and societies to do the right thing.
Great, thank you, Susan. And finally, Wasim, with all of your oversight of the complex sort of policy framework, what would be your choice as a sort of leverage point?
I think it's a very difficult question, honestly. I think there's to pick a single pathway, let's say, and I think I can't overlook the abundance of research that's present in the UK and in universities like the University of Southampton, and the types of solutions that we are able to offer. And I think despite a number of strategy documents laying out how the UK government plans to use scientific research to inform its decisions, I think there's still a lot of effort to be made there in that area there, and just tapping onto the knowledge base that we have and making the most use of our understanding of the oceans and the solution that could be offered.
Thanks very much, Wasim. Now, I am conscious of time, and we've worked our way through a lot of questions. Finally, we received a question from Alexandra Pedchenko, wanting to know actually what I had personally learned about life from exploring the oceans. And Alexandra said, this is a question about life philosophy, lessons about self and others, success and happiness, and simply being here on Earth. So Alexandra, thank you for such a wonderful question. I'd like to offer my answer, but then also ask the same question to my colleagues. So personally, what have I learned from exploring the oceans? There are two parts to it for me. First of all, I've come to recognise that why we explore the oceans has always been an expression of the society doing that exploring. So go back 500 years, it was very much about empire building. More recently, it's about national hegemony to some extent. So I think if we want to build a better ocean future for all of us, then inevitably we also need to be building a fairer, more inclusive society, in our local communities, in science, and also in our global society of nations. So for me, I've come to realise that preventing future harm to the oceans is fundamentally entwined with building a fairer society as well. And then sort of on a personal level, actually, in recent years, I've stepped back from ocean exploration so that I could, help care for my parents in the final years of their lives, and also in becoming a parent myself. And really what I've come to realise is that it's the relationships we build with others. And that's something we do a lot personally when we're out there taking part in expeditions. It's great to be in this sort of team of dedicated and motivated people. But it's also, those broader relationships in the rest of our lives. Because ultimately that's what we leave behind us. So whether that perspective that I've developed has come from journeys exploring the ocean, or indeed the journey we all have through life, that I really can't answer. But thank you, Alexandra, for that lovely question, I think, for us to end on. I'd now like to ask the same question to my colleagues. So, Harry, what have you learned over the years from all your work with the oceans?
Well, I think I came into oceanography as a kind of from a physics perspective. I was going to learn about the physics of ocean circulation and how to measure it and what effect it has on us. And I'm very pleased that the science has changed to more societal relevance, as we say, about climate in terms of climate change, and how the ocean is changing with time really does matter. And I think what I've probably learned more in terms of the work I've done is how important teamwork is. teamwork, as John said, teamwork in terms of going to sea, making the measurements, but also teamwork in science in analyzing the measurements and pushing forward the understanding of ocean circulation.
Mm-hmm.
Teamwork is key.
Thank you very much, Harry. Susan, what's your perspective on this very big question?
It is a very big question indeed. And I think, perhaps from the perspective of being an engineer, is that we step back and make sure that we are seeing the big picture. And very often, an engineer's brief is to deliver something that works, within the parameters given, and that, we should all step back and try and understand how that interacts and interfaces with everything else that is going on. And I think that is just as true in everything, all of our actions in our everyday lives, as much as being an engineer in the ocean.
Great, thank you very much. Wasim, would you like to round it off for us, please?
Yes, thank you, John. I have the luxury to have come from a different place and come to the UK and experience a different perspective that my own perspective of the ocean has changed in that journey as well. And I haven't been exploring the ocean on a ship or anything like that, or I haven't done underwater monitoring or anything of that sort. But it's this recognition that there are different perspectives in the world. And at the individual level, but also in between nations, and it affects the whole diplomatic effort that goes around the oceans. That hopefully in the upcoming summit next week, we will see some progress in that area. But that's the point that I would add to what has already been said. So having an open mind to the idea that we have different perspectives about the ocean and the way that we want to use it or protect it, or according to different priorities.
Thank you, Wasim. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's event. So thank you so much to our panel of excellent speakers sharing their expertise and insight. We know we must act now, but I think it's been really assuring to hear about how groundbreaking research is helping to inform the ways in which we can act more effectively or most effectively. And thank you all as our audience tonight. It's your continued support that helps us to drive forward change and build a better future for all of us. It's been great to have so many of you with us. In a moment, you'll see a short poll on your screen, which we kindly ask you to complete. It's no more than 2 minutes of your time. And we'll be sharing the footage from tonight's event over the coming days. So please do keep an eye on your inbox for details of how you can access this. Thank you all for joining us. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Good night.